All right, we're gonna get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to the keynote address of our 62nd Institute on Journalism Ethics. My name is Ali Colon, and I am the Knight Professor of Media Ethics at Washington Lee. Before I introduce this evening's distinguished guest, Keith Woods, who is the Vice President of Diversity at NPR, I would like to recognize and thank the other professionals who have been gracious enough to join us at this time despite their really busy schedules. I'd also like the fellows to please stand as I introduce you and remain standing until all of you have been named, and we'll hold our applause until the end. Steve Buttry is the Director of Student Media at Louisiana State University. Ann Doe is a reporter at the Los Angeles Times. Jerry Large is a columnist at the Seattle Times. Jennifer Preston is the Vice President of Journalism at the Knight Foundation. Alex Tizon is Professor of Journalism at the University of Oregon. And Mary Williams Walsh is a financial writer for the New York Times. Thank you very much for coming here. I've been very fortunate during this afternoon to have all these fellows very engaged with my ethics class, who have been going over case studies and discussing what is ethical, what isn't about each of these case studies, and both the students and the fellows have been really excellent in pursuing and trying to understand and explain what's going on. So I also want to acknowledge that the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which is underwriting our Ethics Institute seminars and the lecture today. As you may have surmised by the title of today's lecture, Combating the Brutality of Bias with Great Journalism, we may be in for a brutal evening. But before Keith Woods battles that brutality, I want to provide you with some reasons as to why I sought him for this keynote at this time. I first met Keith in 1996 when I was invited to attend a seminar he led on diversity at the Poynter Institute. The Institute is a global leader in journalism, has trained thousands of professional journalists in ethics, writing, editing, leadership, and visual journalism. I subsequently joined the faculty at Poynter, where Keith and I became a colleague and a mentor to me. In the many seminars we worked together, I saw Keith thoughtfully probe and pursue not just what was reported, but what it meant. I remember one seminar in which he led a group of seasoned journalists for over an hour and pushed them to confront their biases and how it affected journalists. What we didn't know is that we'd have to do it all over again because of something else that took place, and we still went even deeper. That has been Keith's modus operandi for years, going deeper, looking below the surface, reminding us that journalistic ethics calls us to not just speak truth to power, but to speak the truth to ourselves. His work at NPR has helped the news organization and its NPR affiliates to better understand the responsibility they have that requires not just telling stories, but telling more authentic stories that capture the multitude of voices representing our communities. When I talked to Keith about what he might focus on today, the issue of bias and the brutality that can sometimes accompany it rose to the surface. For me, that involved a number of questions. Is it the brutality that poses a problem? Or the bias? Or the linkage of the two? Can brutality be good? After all, don't we ask some people to be brutally honest and then regret it right afterwards? Can bias be good? Do we even know what the words mean? Or can such words be weaponized when people decide to arm themselves? Frankly, are we any more or less brutal and biased than we have ever been in our history? Or do we suffer from a historical, social, and political amnesia that condemns us to a linguistic version of Jean-Paul Sartre's no exit? And how does great journalists help us from grading on each other? I'm searching for answers. I know Keith Woods will help provide some clues as to how we might find them. Please welcome Keith Woods.
Okay, so am I supposed to turn this thing on now? So good evening. I'd like to thank my former colleague, Professor Cologne, for this invitation and extend my appreciation to the Washington and Lee University family. I'm also very happy to be here with you on this gorgeous fall day to talk about a profession I've loved for nearly 40 years. A profession I've shared with some of the fellows you've met today. Now, I'd like to talk to you some about that, and then invite you to ask questions and join me in a larger conversation. So first, I'll share with you these thoughts. Back in the prehistoric days of communication, the 1980s, I worked as a sports writer for my local newspaper, the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Back then, there was no Twitter, Facebook, or cell phones, even before Al Gore invented the internet. We had to talk to the public on actual landlines. So when someone thought we were guilty of bias, they'd call us up and let us have it. Usually late on a Saturday night, usually from a bar. And it could be brutal. There you go again, some guy would scream into the telephone when the early editions of the newspaper hit the street. Your bias is showing. You put LSU on the front page, and you stuck Tulane on the back of the sports page. Why don't you people just admit that you hate Tulane? The next week, it would be someone in Baton Rouge calling with proof that we hated LSU. I hated the telephone. But in those earliest days of my career, I understood how fraught the relationship between the media and the public could be. They could be paranoid, and we could be aloof. So there were many times when we met, or rather there weren't many times where we met on neutral turf to talk about this thing called bias. Maybe we can do that for a little while this evening. You might have thought when you read the title of my speech that I'd talk about the havoc and destruction that media bias has wrought in American society, combating the brutality of bias with great journalism. My good friend Ali Cologne and I came up with that one. Now there's some bias in media, no doubt. And when your definition of media includes every means of communication there is out there, every Twitter and Facebook account, every network and local broadcast news program, everything in newsprint, every newsletter that hits your email in the morning, well, there's probably been a lot of bias in the media. But when I speak of the brutality of bias, I'm not talking about whether the LSU headline was bigger than the Tulane headline, or today, whether we're raking as much muck about Donald Trump as we are about Hillary Clinton. I'm talking about the pounding democracy has taken, in part because of the way the very idea of bias has been distorted. Now, there's probably a short path between those two notions. Democracy under assault, bias twisted like a pretzel, and my point is on the end of those two. But as with every time I'm near the Blue Ridge Mountains, I prefer the long, scenic route. So let's start with my paper route. I was 16 years old delivering the Times-Picayune, and I read as I walked, noticing along the way that black people in the city seldom rated prominent treatment in the newspaper unless they were the cause of something bad that happened to white people. I noticed how black people were identified by their race, whether or not race had anything to do with the story. Bias, I thought. Sure enough, when I was 30 and working as an assistant city editor of that newspaper, I interviewed the late Walter Cowan, who'd for years led the Picayune's sister newspaper, the State's Item. I was trying to combat the uneven portrayal of people of color in the newspaper, and I asked Cowan why it was that the State's Item seemed to routinely, inexplicably identify black people by their race, but rarely white people. He told me that his generation of editors thought of black New Orleans as a separate society, and not part of the society that included the newspaper's readership. There was no need to identify the insiders, he explained to me. So only the outsiders, black and brown people, were written about that way. That's bias. Consequential bias. It had an impact well beyond whether we gave one football team more ink than another. It was also biased when the editor of the Times-Picayune, Charlie Ferguson, told his newsroom leaders in the late 1980s that he didn't want former Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard David Duke, yes, the David Duke who is now running for the Senate in Louisiana, the David Duke who debated over other Senate candidates on the campus of an historically black college, Dillard University, my alma mater. The editor didn't want that David Duke on the front page of his newspaper unless Duke was dead or in jail. That's bias. And it was bias whenever we focused only on the negative things that hurricanes did when they hit the city like New Orleans. Yes, the storms flooded and wrecked and killed, but they also brought much needed rain and culled the weak trees and houses and people from the herd. But we never talked about the good things hurricanes did. Yes, sir. Bias. Now, I trust that last example struck you as ridiculous. I hope the one about separate societies left you appalled. And I wonder what you think about the morality and ethics of an editor who once banned a Klansman from the front page of his newspaper. All bias, but not the same. Stick with me on this winding path as I connect those two ideas I started with. Bias twisted like a pretzel, and democracy under assault. Here's what I found after 38 years in a relationship with journalism. There is real bias. There is the appearance of bias. And there is the perception of bias, that which lies in the eye of the beholder. They might all feel the same, but they are not the same. A news organization, for example, might identify the political leanings of conservatives and conservative groups, but not do the same when the people or the groups are liberals. I've seen that happen often in journalism. That's real bias. The same news organization might have only Republican sources for a story today with no liberals, even though yesterday there might have been more liberals than the day before. But that will give the appearance of bias, especially if you didn't see the story the other day. And you may perceive as biased any coverage of gays, lesbians, bisexuals, or people who identify as transgender, even if the coverage appears to give, if the coverage appears to give legitimacy to sexual and gender identities that you find objectionable. One is unquestionable bias. One may be purely appearance. One is simply how you perceive things, and they are not the same. The problem is that just as it's imprecise to refer to the media as though Breitbart is the same quality of journalism as NPR, it's destructive to speak of bias as though the perception of a couple of drunk sports fans, the coincidental juxtaposition of facts in a story over 2 days, and the unapologetic and partisan bias of some cable networks or talk radio shows or websites are all the same. That conflation falsely and unfairly impugns the credibility of all legitimate, rigorous, fair-minded, and yes, fallible journalism. The kind of journalism that led NPR's Howard Burkus to expose the corporate malfeasance behind the Upper Big Branch mine disaster that killed 29 coal miners in West Virginia. When you tar all of journalism with the same brush of bias, you undermine the kind of investigative reporting Caitlin Dickerson did in revealing for the first time the US military practice in World War II of exposing black soldiers to mustard gas to see if their skin had a higher tolerance for the toxins that later devastated their bodies and cut short their lives. When you don't make the distinction between what you think is bias and what really is bias, all journalism becomes suspect, and you no longer trust the media when they tell you that Hillary Clinton did misuse and mislead when it came to her emails, and Donald Trump did say and do reprehensible things to and about women. Historically, journalism has had some undeniably built-in biases. Our profession has a bias in favor of truth. We favor fairness. We are biased against political evasion, obfuscation, corruption, demagoguery. We have a bias in favor of the unheard and the dispossessed. We believe discrimination in any form is wrong, that any killing at the hands of the state must be examined and called to account. We shouldn't hide or run from those biases, those values. They are what make journalism indispensable. Today, more than at any time I can remember, the lines between perception, appearance, and reality that make up the universe of bias have been all but obliterated. Great journalism helps you to weigh the difference between all those so that they aren't all lumped together as though they're the same, as though an editor's decision to treat one race of people differently from another is the same bias as another editor's decision to exclude an unapologetic bigot from the front page, or the same thing as a bias toward encouraging people to flee a killer hurricane rather than spend that precious ink to extol the rejuvenating impact of flooding on a city's aquifer. Great journalism tells you about the controversy surrounding the Clinton Foundation's solicitation of donors and the controversy surrounding Donald Trump's use of his foundation fund to make a political contribution to Florida's Attorney General. It tells you when Donald is lying and when Hillary is lying. And it helps you understand when something is criminal and when something is just bad judgment. I work for one of the nation's top news organizations, serving one of the largest audiences in this business. I'm not the least bit shy about saying that my colleagues and our peers across the industry work hard to keep the bad biases in check and keep the good ones top of mind. They endure criticism and suspicion and indiscriminate accusations of bias so that they can inform people such that, that those people can make good decisions in this democracy. Sometimes that work costs them a few gray hairs and some missed birthdays. Sometimes they have to risk the pulsating threat of a political crowd riled up by their champion. Sometimes, as was the case with NPR colleagues David Gilkey and Zabi Tamana, they pay the ultimate cost of telling stories people must need to hear. David and Zabi were killed by a rocket-propelled grenade in Afghanistan. This business of journalism's worth is not an academic exercise. So here is where my meandering trail concludes. The idea of bias, so twisted and distorted that you can't tell perception from reality, rips into the core of journalistic credibility. And when the media, the fourth estate, one of the historic checks and balances in America's glorious experiment in self-governance, when that media is so undermined, democracy itself is imperiled. That is the brutality we combat with great journalism. It seems a little dramatic to say that democracy is at risk, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go that far. But from Wall Street to the C-suite to the halls of Congress to City Hall, we have seen some of the most influential institutions in our country falter and fail. And it's left to the people, the ones who make up our readership, click on our digital stories, read our tweets and Facebook posts, tune in and download our audio stories and our podcast. It falls to them to set the ship of state right. How do we play our part in helping them to do that if our credibility is so in question? Our work is to reach for excellence, deliver greatness, and speak up boldly when anyone, be they a corrupt small-town mayor or flamboyant and blustery presidential candidate, conflates uninformed opinion with human perception and true bias, and then hurls that destructive mixture like a stone at the fragile face of our profession. Our work is to be our best selves and accept the human frailty of bias and still achieve greatness. So that's my prepared remarks. And I'm ready to take your questions. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this really falls into the category of bias, but one of the things that has really stood out to me over the last year in talking about all the candidates, and it starts to feel like bias to me, is this proclivity for addressing and calling everybody by their first names. How did that happen? And going back even a step before that, I get virtually, I'd say 95% of my news from NPR, so you're my source for everything.
Yes.
Somewhere, when we transition from President Bush to President Obama, we dropped the president
Yeah,
on NPR.
we did.
What happened there? So talk to me about how you refer to people.
Okay.
And is there bias in there? I don't know the answer to that, but explain that to me.
So there was a style change at NPR, and I'm going to struggle to remember the guidance that we got when the style change came down. That said that it gave the journalist permission to refer to the president in the second reference by his last name or her last name, rather than saying Mr. Obama or President Obama. Actually, we have been saying Mr. Obama or Mr. As the title for the presidents on second reference for years. So it was a small change to allow the journalist more flexibility in how he or she referred to the president. It was unrelated, in a sense, to the fact that Barack Obama had been elected president. But if you go back to that day, that time in the country, everything, every change, every difference that we saw around anything, is that me doing that noise? Was seen through this very different light. Yeah, okay, sorry. I've got a loose microphone. Everything was seen through this very different light because we had, for the first time, a black man in the White House, and the public wondered, whenever there was a small change, is that because there's a different president there? I would say that those things were fairly unrelated, and the changing of the presidency gave the organization the opportunity to do something that they'd wanted to do for a while. On the first name thing, I would say that in a lot of ways, that's influenced as much by the public and the candidates as it is by the media. When you look at for example, Hillary Clinton's signage, it is an H, right? And she has been herself, in fact, both of these candidates, in the public eye for so long, in so many different ways, that the familiarity that comes with those names, Cher becomes Cher at some point if she ever had a last name, and we don't refer to them anymore by the rest of the name. I think you would find that several things in society have shifted, and you and I could get into the kind of harumphing conversation that I would like to get into about all of those dang things that have changed in our society. But Jeb Bush, in all of his signage since he was running for governor of Florida, has referred to himself as Jeb. We've made a shift societally, I think, as far as that's concerned. If you don't like it, it's bias. If you think it's fine, it's cool. I saw a hand up down here somewhere. Sir.
You spoke about kind of how a lot of the onus when it comes to determining bias, you kind of have to have that context when it comes to the source. But in an age where the media is becoming so increasingly technological and digitally based, it can be really hard to determine the credibility or bias within a source. You can just see it on your news feed. So do you think that media is sort of going to just keep coming under attack or scrutiny going forward, or do you think that things are going to get better?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. So the question is, with the sort of advent of all of these different sources of information, and I'll put air quotes around news to kind of capture what I think you were saying, that with all of these various sources of information, some of them credible and real, and some of them fairly biased. How does the public, are we going to continue to have this debate about bias, or will things get better? And I would venture that in the foreseeable future, we are where we are going to be in this debate. What I think has to change here is the public. And there have been some efforts in the country in this conversation of what's called media literacy, to advocate for a more discerning public, to teach the public how better to figure out the difference between credible and, made up. Because it does, in fact, look the same when it hits your Twitter or it hits your Facebook. Until you click in, you don't know whether you have just read something that came from the New York Times, or Joe's Times. And one of the problems I think we have as a country right now is that is my microphone? I don't hear myself. Okay. I think one of the problems that we have in the society today is that we're affected by what we're seeing in that feed. It's altering how we see the world, and for everything that we click into and interrogate very deeply, there'll be 10 things that we consume that just came in as headlines and we never looked at again. And there is a point, and I say this often, I find myself saying this often, where I have to stop and say, I don't know how I know this. And now I'm starting to get scared about the thing that I will say next, because I don't know how I know it. Did I get this from something that I just read on the NPR website? Did I hear it in a meeting in which somebody was talking about a story? Or did it come across my family's Group Me account and one of my children had sent something to me and said, Dad, have you seen this? I don't know where I get it from anymore. And we have to be discerning enough, at the very least, to stop before we disseminate something, even if it's already hit us, and check it out and say, how do I know this? And more importantly, how do they know this? And that is, I think, a responsibility of an informed public. I don't think that we're there right now, and I think that that's one of the reasons that we have some of the debates about things that really aren't up for debate. We argue over things that are obviously and clearly true, but debate the credibility of it because the information we're getting is coming from so many different ways. Yeah.
First, I want to affirm your your pro-LSU bias.
I went to Tulane, man. I got a graduate degree from Tulane.
But secondly, I'd like you to talk a little about, that there's an effort underway in journalism to do fact-checking, particularly with politicians, in a structured way that I think honestly attempts to take as much bias as possible out of our journalism, to just say, here's a statement purporting to be fact, and we've looked at the facts, and here's whether it's true or not. At the same time as this whole aspect of bias and accusations of bias and all that you've described so well, and yet it's kind of brushed aside with no consequence by the politicians that we're trying to hold to account.
Well, so the question is, how do we move toward a fact-checking kind of base in journalism when partisans in our sort of political conversations today simply wave off all of the fact-checking that anybody has done if it does not align with the facts that they would want to hold on to. And I would say again, I don't want to get Pollyanna here, because I don't know that I have an optimistic view of where we're going next. I think it is an untenable place that we are right now as a democracy and as a society, that we can debate, whether in fact that sky out there is blue. If everything is called into question that way, then where will we go? But I think journalism's job, and I think it's like any other important part of your life, your relationships in any part of your life. Our job is to stand consistent and resolved in the notion that as human beings, we walk into every situation with bias. It is a silly conversation to suggest that it doesn't exist. And our responsibility as credible journalists is to constantly do everything that we can to mitigate it. And at the same time, do everything that we can to help our public understand what they must understand in order to make a good decision. So when politicians obfuscate or outright lie, our job is not to moralize and discuss whether or not they're going to heaven or hell. Our job is to say, yes, they said this, and here are some facts over here. Your job as the public is to determine whether I've just presented you with valid information. And that's the best that journalism can do in that exchange. There's been a ramping up of this, but as I follow our very excellent, and I am a partisan of the First Order when it comes to my organization, I follow our very excellent fact-checking as we went through three debates between the two nominees. And I think it was extraordinary work. And the bias, such as it is, that lives there has to do with what we know and what we don't know. And we can fact check the things that we know. And if we don't know it to be untrue, we can't fact check it. We can't add anything to it. And that then creates its own bias. It's the bias that comes with the limitations of the diversity of your staff. And I mean that diversity in the fullest expression of that word. What's incredible to see when you read the live fact checking that was going on is the vast amount of knowledge that lives on that staff, from economics and business to faith to the thing that the politicians said in a conversation 17 years ago. It lives in this group of journalists. And then there are all of the things that don't. So our job is to just say, look, we can't do it all, and we can't be anything better than human. But that does not mean that we shouldn't aspire every single day that we go into work to provide people with the very best approximation of fairness and accuracy as we can. And that's, in the face of everything that we're seeing, that's the best we're going to do. Yes, sir.
How do you avoid the false equivalency trap when, in fact, given issues, the two sides are not equivalent?
And when you say false equivalencies, you mean?
When if one side of an issue is making egregiously incorrect statements, and the other side is addressing the statement, but not making egregious falsehood. But then we say, well, both sides do it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the ways that you address false equivalencies is you stop saying stuff like that, right? You stop saying, well, everybody lies. Yeah, well, first of all, that's true. I was trying to figure out, well, did I just lie when I said that? No. I got stuck for a minute there. First of all, it's true, but our job always is to provide people with context, not just fact, right? Context lends meaning to fact. And if I only provide you with facts, yes, everybody lies. That person lied over there and that person lied over there, without providing you with the context to understand the significance of the lie, then I've failed you in my role in journalism. And I think that you put your finger on something that has been particularly bad, I think, over the course of the last 18 months of this campaign. These things that say, well, I'm just going to, on the one hand, there is this, and on the other hand, there is that. I think our responsibility is not to tell you that this is worse than that. Our responsibility is also not to tell you that they're the same. And if I can choose not to do either of those things and instead provide you with the fullest articulation of what happened, then I can step back and trust you as an intelligent person to figure out the difference between the two. And even if you aren't going to figure it out, I still have done the best that I can do, and there's no more, frankly, that I could. Yes, sir.
So besides NPR, do you have certain news outlets in the mainstream media that you favor against other ones? For example, what is your go-to channel when getting news when you're just watching TV by yourself? And are there any ones on your radar that you think has been doing a poor job when addressing their own biases?
So a minute ago, I was talking about intelligence, and I'm way too intelligent to answer that question. What I will tell you is that I consume deeply wherever I consume, and I don't tune out anything. I don't tune out anything. I am listening. I am an informed consumer of journalism. I'm an informed consumer of news, and I will listen to anything. But I will be listening for your proof. I will be listening for your rigor. I will be listening to determine, watching, reading to determine whether you have done your homework. And the moment I suspect you haven't, we are done. And I'm moving on. So I think that, I can find a fault with every news organization out there, including my own. I have a bias, stated right out there in front of you. But I can find the fault in all of them. And there are clearly some that are not concerned at all with fact and not concerned at all with rigor. I will still consume them on the chance that, like the National Enquirer in the John Edwards case several years ago, they might throw a dart into the world and actually hit news. Someone else. Sir.
Do you get concerned with the influx of information we have now? Do you get concerned when people like pile up facts that maybe present things in a way that are not necessarily true to what the facts actually mean? For example, like if you like just say a bunch of like things that are true but don't really like mean what you mean them to say.
Yeah, well, so am I worried about the people who are essentially assembling the facts that support their position, all of which are true facts,
Yeah.
but absent some other facts that would change my understanding? Yes. And in politics today, and I don't mean like today, but in our recent years, I think the political machines of America have gotten really good at that. And have gotten really good at taking bits and pieces of true information, a little snippet of something someone said over here, a little snippet of something someone said over there, and providing it and presenting it then to the public and saying, see, this is why you can't trust them. This is why you shouldn't give them your vote. And I think, again, it takes time and energy and dedication as a citizen to keep listening past that and digging beyond it, because that dynamic isn't going to change. If it wins, someone's going to do it again. And again, no false equivalency, but it's everybody on this one. They're all doing it. And it makes me angry when the people I trust, the people I want to believe in, are doing exactly the same thing as the other folks. They're all doing it. Our job is to figure out how to hear through it, challenge it, get enough information ourselves. Yes, sir.
So I want to hear more about what you mean by that our democracy is under assault. One of the vulnerabilities of democracy that's inherent in it is the susceptibility to demagoguery.
Yeah.
And NPR often does a very good job of drilling down on the facts and giving context. Like, let's talk about a specific example. Trump several times has said that Hillary Clinton laughed about a 12-year-old rape victim when she was representing the defendant. And just the other day, you drill down on that, and it turned out that it wasn't, she was seen laughing, but it was a tape. It was pretty hard to hear. But Roy Reed had actually made this tape. He was the only one in the room, the reporter from Arkansas. And he, as the only witness, said that this was in no way laughing at the victim, but laughing at the system. But that doesn't make any difference, does it? To the demagogic use of that so-called fact that she laughed at the victim.
But there again, there is in that whole string with Hillary Clinton, in that whole moment, there was a bias, a real bias that she revealed about herself. And then this thing that you've just described is the thing that I see from the other side of the television screen, and I'm like, that is a perceived bias, and I don't know the difference between one and the other. And I think, again, great journalism keeps digging and keeps digging and keeps trying to answer the question. But when I talk about democracy being imperiled, I'm going to cop to the fact that I believe that journalism is a pillar of a free society, that a free press is critical to a democratic society. You can't really have one without the other successfully. And we have all sorts of checks and balances in this country to make sure that no one piece of this machine runs amok on us. But what happens when those pieces, when the Congress pretty much shuts down for 8 years? What happens when the presidency is neutered? What happens when newspapers across this country go through the economic decline that they went through, and the watchdogs of American society are laid off and bought out, right? Well, if I forget who said this, and again, it could have been in my Twitter feed, it could have been my wife. I don't remember where it happened, but that this is a good time to be a corrupt politician. Why? Because when everything else failed, the journalists sniffed it out. The journalists found it and told everybody and rang the bell. And that supports democracy. When that starts eroding, when we've taken this notion of bias as a weapon and said, let me discredit all of it by calling it all the same thing, then the watchdog, that role that we have as a society, is imperiled, it's eroded. And I think I think it's a fear many of us have at a time when not just this dynamic that we're talking about in politics, but also the economics of being in media, all of those things are in danger. Last question, how are we doing?
We'll get 2 more questions.
Okay, so here and then here.
So in the aftermath of this election, rebuilding trust in journalism needs to be a priority for everyone in the business. So one question is, how might we go about that when the national news cycle has been driven by national media organizations, even local media organizations like the Washington Post, is now a national organization. So we have the 2 coasts, and then we have the middle of the country. So how does journalism, how do journalists gain the trust of the 38% of core supporters of Donald Trump, of what we've learned in the last year, people who don't think that their interests have been heard.
So the question is, how does journalism rebuild credibility and trust in the country for itself, if it has that role in democracy? And I would add, because the 38% you mentioned who lack that trust and who are aligned with Donald Trump are matched by the people who had that same sense of distrust. And you heard them in the early days of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and you hear them even today in conversations about the two alternative candidates. That there is a distrust out there. I don't know that I believe that it's all rational distrust, personally. I think it's a lot of, maybe I don't know if it's a lot. I think that there is a good deal of distrust in institutions that is now sort of everybody, right? If I distrust the bank, I distrust them all. If I distrust the politician, I distrust the bank. So I don't know that journalism itself has the capacity to fix some of that. I do think that again, the strength of the institution, and the Washington Post is a great example of a newspaper that was on the ropes and fought back and is now, returning to the sort of national greatness that it had in the Watergate days. But you go on the other coast and you go in many other parts of this country, Tribune Media, on the ropes as a company. So it's not just the middle of America that's in danger. I think that much of this country, if we are dependent on strong media, has a challenge right now. Our job is to, continue to insist upon the standards that we have tried to hold in the face of those who are surrendering those standards, and B, find new ways and search for new people like Jeff Bezos, who at their core believe in the democratic value of journalism and are not just looking to buy something to either get a tax write-off or soothe their egos. And we can't do all of that as journalism. We're very fortunate in public radio in that we have a business model that is the support of the public. The public actually pays for what we do. Newspaper public never did. The newspaper public paid so little for what actually got produced to this day in the newspaper. It's the advertisers who pay for the newspapers, not the subscriber. The public radio listener pays for what we do, and that's a model that other organizations are now trying to find a way into by tapping into, tapping into a nonprofit model. But I don't know that I could give you the big answer. I know what we have to do. These organizations that are still strong have to be consistent and hold on. Last question, sir.
On this date, the 100th anniversary of the birth of Walter Cronkite, what can we learn from him in this context?
So the question is, what could we learn? What is it? Which birthday is it?
100th.
The 100th birthday of Walter Cronkite. What could we learn? I think that there are immutable values to journalism, and I think there have been people in the history of this profession, and I think of Edward R. Murrow as one of them, who have cautioned us since the beginning of, in this case, of broadcast journalism, that it is always possible for this thing that we do to be cheapened and to become something other than what it could be, other than its greatest potential. And we've seen it in I think once respectable media, and in the advent of lots of media that never had a day of respectability. What I think you could learn from Cronkite is that those values that he seemed to most espouse, high integrity independence, a dedication to the truth, an empathy for the full public. Those things are the immutable qualities of journalism. And even as we are being assailed by the people who don't like that we don't agree totally with them, those things will last, and they will be the things that serve the journalists who survive well into the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.